Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade here, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. Today we actually left ourselves in a pretty obvious situation from last week. We implemented some explicit room placement code and we just didn't get a chance to really use it. We typed it all in, but we haven't debugged it yet. And so what we want to do today is just debug that code. That's it. That's what we want to do. And then we can start expanding on it and seeing where how we want to move forward with how rooms get placed in the generative part of the engine at the moment. Today is day 449, so start with day 448's code if you're following along at home. I'm sure everyone knows that by now, so probably don't need to say it. But so if we go ahead and build the game, we actually don't crash or anything, or crashes. I don't know why we would crash, but we don't assert in the placement code or anything like that. But you can see that we don't, for some reason, the camera gets placed sort of as if there was nothing to place it on, or as if we don't know where the hero should go or something like that. Which is weird because if you look, you can see that some things got placed. So there is something strange going on. I'm not sure what, and that is our job for today, is to debug this and figure out why we're getting this sort of strange situation occurring. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with that, and that's going to be our job for today. And then based on how long it takes us to get everything working, we'll see. We may end up with some time to do something additional. We don't really know, though, so we'll see about that a little bit later on. So if you remember how this code works, we set up, when in sort of the end of the code here, we return a result code, which is basically saying, here's where this stuff is that you may want to use in the outside code. And the way that works is, we call, okay, so never mind. This obviously now makes perfect sense. So we just never implemented that. It's just still sitting here with a hard-coded placement. So that's why. That's got to be why. We didn't actually put the camera anywhere where the game could successfully start up, probably, right? This initial camera P is just wrong. So what we want to do is when we get this orphanage back, we want to use that information to actually put the camera in like the middle of the room, right? That's what we would like to do. And so to set the initial camera P there, what we'd want to do is use the information that we've got on the room, which is we've got the volume of the room right there. So what we want to do is set that initial camera P to something in a more sensible way. So what I can do here is just say, all right, let's take a look at the gen volume of the hero's room. So that is hero bedroom that gets set. So once we have that, we should be able to come up with those chunk positions really easily, right? We can just say that where do we put that in here? Here we go. So we can just say that like we've got the min and the max here. If we want to, we can just use like the min plus the max over 2 or something like that, right? So we just start the camera in the middle, like this. So in terms of tile-based positions, that should just do it, right? And off we go. So that, if that actually was the only problem, will be fairly uninteresting. So we will be doing other stuff today, but we don't know. There might be more to it than that. Anyway, let me grab out the volume here. Like I said, I don't know why I didn't grab the volume. And then the hero room's min and max there should be... Oh, these are not actually Gen V3s. We should probably fix that. I don't know if now is the time to do it. But it seems like we want to sort of consolidate those two. Anyway, that should start the camera now actually looking at the actual room where the hero is supposed to be, in theory anyway. So let's see if we can get that working. And so the hero is there, actually. And again, I'm not sure why we're lower down. That should set the Z to something correct, I would think. Not sure what the rest of the stuff here is doing. We don't use any of this. We can probably get rid of most of it now. In fact, this stuff can kind of go away. We really don't need most of that. But I'm going to step in there because I don't really know why that wouldn't work. We should be able to set it to the center and have it work, but the initial camera P, I'm not really sure much about how it gets handled anymore. We haven't looked at that code in a while. So I don't know if maybe there's something weird about that doesn't actually work properly. Why don't I just trace that through, and then we can see. I'm going to go ahead and set to a debug build so I can step through the code and see all the variables easily. So let's stop at create world, and we'll just see here in create world. That's not the create world I meant this one. When we get this back, right here, I'm going to just inspect it really quickly just to make sure it all makes sense and we're not passing anything silly, but it looked like it was putting us in the right place, so I think we're okay. Here's where it put that room. That's the basic idea there. And so we can sort of see if we place ourselves somewhere sensible relative to that. So our max of 1 there, well, these are chunk indices actually. So to be honest, it's a little bit harder to look at. Let me go ahead and verify that they're correct on a tile basis, because that we actually know more about. Okay. So if I jump in here, I should now be able to see what we actually passed. 12, -56, 0. So that's what we actually said we were gonna, that's where we wanted everything to be, right? And so let's make sure that that actually makes sense with the hero room. So if the min and the max is 10 to 14, then 12 does make a lot of sense, right? That's right in the middle. That's exactly what we expect. -56 is right in the middle from -59 to -54 there. So that's actually quite good too. And 0 is exactly what we would have expected for min z. So it looks like we're placing the camera in the correct place relative to the hero's bedroom. That seems correct to me. So given that, I'm going to go ahead and say I want to then look at the world creation, the room creation code. Because we still sort of have, and we don't really know whether we want to keep this long term. But we still have this idea over here of a sort of room area, right? Like a volume that the room looks at to figure out where to place the camera. And so what I would like to do is make sure that that is still getting set in a sensible fashion, because I don't know that it is. We set the X count, Y count, and Z count to be how big the room was. And we know these things here. Z count being 2 is a little bit weird. I'm not really sure how we ended up with a room with a dimension of 2. I would like to know. So we're still doing, it looks like, so quickly I would like to just address this because I don't really want that. It looks like the way that we're making these rooms at the moment, when we set the size, it looks like we're setting the size so that they actually have, like the min z and the max z are set apart. Right, so I don't know why that is exactly. I guess our room placement code is doing something a little wonky there. So it's not a problem that they're too high, like too tall, because we allow rooms to do that, but it shouldn't be doing that. So I would like to fix that because that is erroneous. So something's messed up there. So if we take a look at place room along edge, this code, when it actually goes to deal with the Maxon 2, you can see it just copies from the original room all the time. So when we do our initial room placement, yeah, so required dimensions, this just looks like we messed up. It looks like, because this is, we said that our dimensions don't include the fact that the min and the maxi are equal to each other if they encompass a single tile. So this really should have looked like this, is basically what it boils down to. Our initial room placement was not correct there. So now we should have a z count that's properly set to 1, which we do, and now that's a little bit better. Okay, so it must be that we don't properly handle that aspect with the camera. For some reason, if something's too high, we must be messing it up. So we're gonna have to deal with that and look at why that's not working properly, because something is not working properly there. So I'm gonna put a to-do in here that once we're done with what we're working on now, we've got some issue where the camera gets confused about that, or we're creating it wrong. We should go fix that, because there's just something not working there, and it should be working. We don't have any reason to believe that that should occur. It should have just handled that room just fine. There's nothing illegal about doing that in our game. Okay, so if we look at what we've created now, this is our orphanage. And I think what's kind of interesting about this, again, we have to give ourselves a bit of a high five. So remember, we told this thing just about which rooms we wanted and what sides they were on of the other rooms. And what you can see is it laid it out exactly like my diagram. So we did a good job. Congratulations, right? I don't know if you remember my diagram here. Here it is, right? We decided to not do the side alley yet. And to just do this sort of structure for things. And that's exactly what it made, right? It made exactly the orphanage that I wanted. Main room, 2 side rooms, 4 bedrooms here, 3 hero bedrooms here, the hallways, the garden out back, the forest area and whatnot up there. So it actually laid all that out properly. So really all we have to do at this point now is we need to make the doorways in between the rooms be placed, because what we did at the end of the last stream is we placed all the rooms, but we never actually put any code to put in the doors. So unlike the original code here, which put in the doors, this doesn't put in the doors. And when I say doors, I mean the classic rock group with Jimmy Morrison. All right, so if we want to avoid a drug overdose but still want to have doors in the room and play on The Tonight Show, or get banned from The Tonight Show for saying lyrics that the public at large at that time felt were untoward, we can go ahead and look at this piece of code and place the actual doors in when we place connections. So remember, this code here, it loops over the connections that a room has and places those connections, places rooms to match those connections. So we're already at the point where we know exactly what we would do. The only problem is we never put in the code here to set this connection's actual spacing. Now we did that in the other test layout routine. It's this code right here. So you see how we intersect the 2 rooms and then do it that way. So in theory, I think that should work the same. We should be able to just use this code or a modified variant thereof to create our apertures between rooms and then sort of tweak it from there. So let's just take a look and see what happens if we drop this in here. Once we've placed these rooms, we can create a volume that is the intersection of this room and the other room that it's being connected to. At that point, we know exactly where they overlap, and we can try to figure out where we want to put the door. So in order to put the door in, what we want to do is use what was the edge that actually abutted these two together, right? So we know that the edge axis that we're talking about here, the edge axis is the one that we're moving along, I believe, right? Is that correct? Yeah. So the edge axis is the axis we're moving along. That's the axis along which we want to shrink the door so that it doesn't take up the entire room. Now, we could take up the entire room, right? So we could say, we could just say the door is the entire aperture between them, right? And that's just saying, look, it's a completely, it's base room and room. So what that says is just intersect these two volumes, put the door like in their entire intersection. And what that would do is they will be less like doors at that point. Well, of course, it didn't work, so that's irrelevant, I guess. Oh, it didn't work because we don't overlap our rooms in this placement scheme. That's actually why. Okay, so, So first question, do we want to overlap the room walls or not? I don't think we do. So why were we doing that before? So never mind, because yeah, this intersection, we need to expand those two volumes first in order to actually compute that intersection. So that's not going to help us at all. I know why it worked. So this intersection, we were doing it right before. This intersection does the intersection. One of the axes will not intersect. That's the one where they abut, right? And so what we were doing before is we then broadened that notion here, right? We took that place where they wouldn't have overlapped and we gave it some volume there. So never mind, it makes perfect sense. I don't know why I didn't remember that we did this correctly, actually. So this intersection will produce no actual intersected volume, but it will produce the correct bounds for that non-intersection, right? It'll basically produce a 0 volume rectangle right at the aperture between the two rooms. So all we have to do is expand that one in either direction in order to make the room we want. Now, the axis that it's going to use, again, the edge axis is the one running in the direction we actually placed the rooms along, so that's not the one we want. So what we want instead is that alternate axis. Now, we know what the alternate axis is. It's axis A. We already determined what that other axis was, right? And you can see us placing the room, that sort of abutment there. So we know here we can actually do, in this setup here, we can actually take the axis A and grab out what those two values are. Now, I don't want to do it this way. I think this was a stupid way to do it. What I want to do instead is I want to just take the door and I want to take its minimum axis. Because what I know about that is that's actually right at the aperture. The min and the max will be set counter to each other. So the max will be like one smaller and the min, in fact, we can actually just look at this directly. Just so you can see what I'm talking about after this intersection takes place. I just want to show you what I mean, because I'm saying a lot of things here, and you know they're pseudo-clear in my head, but they might not be in your head. I say pseudo-clear because I messed it up the first time, so obviously I did not remember how we were actually doing this, so clear may be a bit of a exaggeration. All right, so if I go ahead and just write this code here so you can look at what I mean when we get these min door, max door things out here. I just got out what that axis was that's not actually being laid out. I'm going to go ahead and step into here. This is what place rooms along edge. So if we come through to place rooms along edge and we kind of hop through here, what we can see is that I need to compile in debug mode, or probably Visual Studio will have no idea where those values are. Where are they? I don't know. I'll never know. I can't possibly find them, says Visual Studio. All right. So I come in here and I look at my two values along that axis. And what I should see is, like I said, they're just one past each other, right? So that's the way that the intersection tells us there is no overlap, right? They're right at the edge. So the min of this door and the max that door, if they both were 0, then it would be one long. Right along 0, it would be one long. But it's not overlapping, so that's why it's 0, -1, right? So all we really need to do here is just flip these, right? We just need to switch which ones we're thinking about here. So we can basically say, okay, if the min door, that was the lowest value that was actually being included there. So we can do like the min door and the min door +1 would give us a 2 wide aperture. Now, I have to think about how the intersection code works to see which one of those we want. But either we use the min door or the max door. Let's take a look at which one we want, right? Here's the room ball. Here's the base room ball. So we're coming from the base room. And which axis are we talking about? Which one was it placing on this time? Oops. Y. So looking at Y, we have 0 to 7 on the base room and -16 to -1, right? So we want -1 to 0, okay? So what we want to do is we want to say, we just want to use the max to the min. So we just want to flip them, right? That's all we need to do. We just need to flip them, and then we've covered the swath, right? And that's all we need to do. So if I come in here to the world gen code and just do that, what I just said, where I just say, okay, the min becomes the max becomes the min for now. That should be sufficient. Now we should be placing doors down like right in the area where rooms overlap, right? And that's what we want. So now when I look at it, we have one more thing to do, right? We're almost there, but what you can see is I don't think we didn't switch the door placement code, because remember we made a change to a big change last episode, where we switched to doing inclusive bounds. I don't think we ever changed this gentleman right here. So I don't know if we did or if we didn't, so we'll have to see. But it looks like, even though this thing clearly oh, nope, maybe we did. I typed it in wrong, typo. So either this will then work, or we still have to go update is in volume to handle it. So we'll see which one it is. All right, so it was just a typo. So we must have updated is in volume last time as well, right? So if I go ahead and switch the build there to optimized, I can go ahead and hop around now and go through the various rooms. So if I want to come out here, this is the hallway, right? This out back, this would be the garden. And now would be a good time too to start looking at that camera code. Remember I said one of the reasons I want to do this is so we can start working on the camera code. You can see now the camera code should be zooming out, right? So we want to start working on that code so we can do that properly. So we come up here, we can go to this other hallway that we made, right? And yeah, so you can see now this is doing essentially exactly what I wanted. The camera and the lighting are up. You can see how they're off. They're not doing the right things. And that's why I wanted to get these maps working. So now we can, once we sort of are a little bit further along with the map building, we can go just make the lighting so it properly encompasses the visible area, and make the camera so it properly zooms to whichever part of a room we're trying to do. You can also see there's like a bit of a confusion right there. The camera can't decide, right? Because we're right on the edge. You can actually see that. We need to adjust those volumes a little bit, right? Because the camera can't decide where to be at that point, and you get that bug. So you can see this is basically doing exactly what I wanted, right? As this starts to come together, we can start to finalize those various systems that we're talking about. But we're in the middle of the generation code right now. I say we push a little bit further on that because we don't need to play the game right now. We can build little worlds and not actually have be able to have like the lighting work properly, and that's fine, right? Although we probably will need a way to zoom around a little bit more quickly so we can look at other things here. But that's sort of a separate issue. So we'll have to adjust our zoom out, zoom in, zoom out camera code so we can get a little bit better sense of that in the meantime. Anyway, so if we keep going on this, what we want to do now is say, well, okay, yeah, that's nice, but that's not how we actually probably want doors to be. We don't want doors to be the entire aperture of where two rooms intersect. We want to maybe just use like the center one, so you're hopping out through a one wide door, the way you might expect a regular, game to be, right? Something a little bit more like what you would expect at the moment from a standard game. So in order to do that, what we want to do is make those room setups, should be right here. What we want to do here is make this so that in addition to setting the min and max to encompass the two wide swath where we want the rooms to connect, we need to adjust the edge axis now. So that edge axis is too wide is the problem. We're using the entire length of the rooms we're using the entirety of where the two rooms overlap to produce that value, and we don't really want to do that, right? What we'd rather do is just take, like, say, the center one. So in order to do that, what we could do is say, door edge equals the centroid. So we could say, like, the doors min of the edge axis plus the doors max of the edge axis divided by 2, right? So the midpoint would be where the door would start. And then what we can do is reset these. So like the edge axis min will be the door edge, and the max will also be the door edge. So we just get a one wide door running down the middle of where they overlap. And if there's not an even point in the middle, it'll just pick one or the other, right? It'll pick the lesser of the two. So if it's not an odd number of tiles, it can't be right in the middle. It'll just pick something to either side, and that's fine, right? So now you can see what happens when we've just got one wide doors in here, right? And so when we hop through here, now we've got what would sort of be more traditionally thought of as a door to a room, right? So there's a single one wide thing, and we hop through it, and that's what we get, right? Now, one of the things that I'm noticing too while I'm looking at this is the eccentricity of that perspective projection is maybe a little bit high. I like having that perspective feel to the game. It's kind of nice, and it gives it a little bit of an additional flair that a normal 2D game doesn't have. But it may be a little bit much because it starts to become, and I'll show you what was making me think that, it starts to become a little bit problematic in cases like this, where like that door is very hard to see here, right? So in terms of where we set up our perspective projection there, we may want to go ahead and tune that down a little bit. So what I'm talking about is, I believe that's over in world mode where we set up the camera. We've got sort of a particular opinion about that focal length, right? And you can see here we've got that setup that we're saying something particularly specific about. And if I was to change what that focal length is, that would be something that we might want to be more specific about. So here you can see us set it for the cutscene. I'm not sure where we set it for. I'm not sure where we set it otherwise. Looks like right here. So it looks like we're just setting it to that, right? So if I look at what we're looking at here, I don't know, where are we here? Set debug mouse P. I don't know if we can just change this value. Yeah, we can. So it may be that we can just go ahead and change this value and then set the camera to be closer down. So if we take a focal length and change it to some different values, we will get different amounts of eccentricity when we zoom in. So maybe we want to just zoom out the camera a little bit from here. Let me go ahead and see about that. So distance above. So focus on room. Looks like it's not even used at the moment. So if we take a look at how far above the camera we're placing, I'm sorry, how far above the target we're placing. What you can sort of see here about how we do that is there's a certain degree of manhandling that we allowed to be done to the camera here, right? So you could set the camera to special locations that you want it to be. And I think it generally just sets the target, and then the target offset Z, it looks like it was just hard-coded to 8, right? Again, like I said, this code, so if I set that to 4, we should zoom in, right? Yeah. So let me set it to something higher. Right? So what you can see based on what I did there, and we've got some other things we'd have to fix, like the fog distances and stuff like that. But what you can see what I did there, do you see how it reduces the eccentricity of, like, I can now see that door more clearly because of how the focal length changes how much perspective there is in any given piece, right? So when you set it like this, you end up setting that eccentricity down quite a bit compared to what it would have been with a different focal length. The focal length of the lens, it basically controls that eccentricity to a large extent, right? And so that's something that that we want to sort of be aware of. And I don't know, maybe I tuned it down a little bit too much. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. I want this game to be fairly top-down because I want you to be able to see pretty clearly what you're hitting and what you're not. One of my big complaints, actually, with Binding of Isaac, a game which I quite like a lot, is just that it's kind of hard to see what your bullets hit because it's so up and down. I'm so lateral in terms of the way that it draws the characters that your brain gets a little confused sometimes about that, I find. And so that's kind of something that I was hoping to maybe get more towards the Hotline Miami perspective, right? Which is straight top down. So I want to kind of have a bit of a mix between those two. I want to try and find a happy medium between those two. Again, not super care. I don't super care about that much because I am not a game designer. So, you know, that's more of a game designer's argument to have. I'm just talking about my personal preference there, and I think that would be better, right? For what I wanted to see. So that's all I'm talking about. So here we now have pretty much everything working the way that I would expect. I do think that eccentricity is good, dialed down a little bit. So I think I will leave it that way for now. Just dialing it down again, just that little bit. And now we've got room layout code that works. So what we can do too is we can expand on this now to produce a fairly large world if we wanted to, right? Like even just right off the bat, we could just generate an entirely, you know, a dungeon area and all that kind of stuff. So maybe we can go ahead and do that and play around with that a little bit. And then what I want to do is start looking at how we want to do more complex room placement, right? And we can choose how we want to do this, like I was saying. It's interesting that the camera doesn't move there. Did you notice that? Like you can't hop back through this thing. Yeah. So camera really wants to get upgraded. So I may ping back to the camera and lighting stuff first and get it to a place where it's a little bit more playable to explore. And maybe we want to put some of the graphics into at that point so we can differentiate our rooms a little bit better, things like that. So, you know, at this point, I'm not going to promise about any sort of order we're doing things in. I might bounce around quite a bit because I just want to bring things up to a playable state. And how we do that is really usually best left up to intuition, right? Whatever seems to be the most annoying thing at that time is usually the best thing to focus on, right? So yeah, I think we kind of want to move intuitively from here. At the moment, I'm thinking, though, I might want to just generate some more stuff. And the other thing I might want to do is produce some way that we can view the world more intelligently than this. So right now, I can't do anything with the debug camera, even to like go look at other regions of the world. And that's kind of annoying. So being able to like click and teleport somewhere to inspect it, or I don't know what, putting in a debug camera system is probably going to be important. All right, let's keep going here. So if I want to sort of continue along this theme, in my world gen code now, like I've got an orphanage layout piece, right? And what you can see from the orphanage layout stuff, the way it's important to sort of mention the reason I did it this way. This is a modular component, actually, at this point, right? So if you wanted multiple orphanages, you just could have them, okay? And so, for example, let's suppose, I just want to show you the power of doing things in this way, where I create something and then it gets laid out in a secondary pass. What I can now do is say, oh, you know, maybe I want 2 orphanages. All right, so I have orphanage 1 and 2. Well, if all I did was that, then what's going to happen is I'm only going to get like one of them, right? So when I actually lay this out, I'm only going to get one of these orphanages, and the other orphanage is not going to be there. And furthermore, depending on which one gets laid out, the hero room might be non-existent, right? Which I think is what probably happened there. If that makes sense. So when it goes to place the camera, it's going to be like wonky and whatever. Because if you remember, the way that our layout code worked in world gen is it starts and it crawls out from a room. It's whatever this first room is, right? Now, you know, maybe we want to be more specific about that. Maybe we want to do this. So maybe I want to do something like this. And then I could at least guarantee it. Of course, we need to do it here. Okay. When we actually do the work here, we could pass it in so we say, oh, you know what? I know I'm going to place people in the hero's bedroom, so that's where I want you to start laying out the world, right? Because we know we want to seed from there. And if I did that, then we would always get that room placed properly, right? And off we would go. Although that looks like we placed multiple. That's a little bit odd. So we were getting some Z fighting there. Did it actually place both of them somehow? It should not have, right? Because the crawler should not have laid the other one out. Hold on a second. I'm freaking out right now. It should have had no way to lay out that first orphanage. I want to make sure I'm not. Oh, so that's just happening. Why are we getting Z fighting stuff happening there? I think I made, do I have a bug in the, did it just place, yeah, it did, never mind. It just decided to place 2 rooms on top of each other there. Okay. So we have a bug we should address first. I'm glad I looked at that because that's wrong. So we do have one bug. You can notice there should be 3 bedrooms, there's only 2. Why is that? It's because one of them was already placed. So what we need to do here as well, right? Because this initial room just gets seeded down, and then this room got placed, And then when it went to place things along this edge, it just started at the top of the edge, and it never checks for overlap, right? So another thing we're going to have to do is checking for overlap, right? We need to figure out whether there's already a room in a place so that we don't place another room there. So that's something we need to be able to do to avoid this. So I'm going to put a to-do in for that as well. I'll ignore it for now because that's not going to affect what I was about to do either way, but I want to be aware of it. So anyway, back to our story. So if I have 2 orphanages, well, I only get 1 orphanage anyway, because I only started laying out at one and they're not connected. But I could just connect these 2, right? I could just say, all right, look, you know, I know that orphanages have a forest entrance and a hero bedroom. Let me just connect the forest entrance of one with the hero's bedroom of the other, and I'll say which direction I want that to go in. Right, we've got this idea of directions. I'll just say that it's a northbound connection. So you're out the top of the forest entrance and you come in the bottom of the hero's bedroom of the other orphanage, right? I believe we also passed the gen there, right? Yeah. So now if I run this code, and I start walking, right? What I should find is that when I get out to the forest path area, which is right here, the other orphanage, and there you can see it, is just attached, right? I really wish I knew why it doesn't detect those sometimes. That's going to be something we're going to have to fix sooner rather than later. But anyway, point being, so I like the way that we've set up this system because I feel like it gives us a really good way to create pieces that can then just be thrown together. And it means that, you know, once we create a thing that produces a usable like piece of a dungeon, for example, we can just call that, right? And be done with it. Yeah, that's really weird. I don't know why those changeovers don't seem to happen properly. Right, like why the camera thing doesn't seem to think that that was a point that it needed to deal with, I have no idea. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. We'll be looking at the camera a little bit later on. So anyway, I really like that aspect of it because now you can just like plop down orphanages as often as you want to plop them down, and you know it just all kind of works. I also think I may want to, let me see what happens if I reduce the size of these rooms to make them not quite so big. It might create all kinds of problems for us here, but I could also make the default distance there be a little higher. Just as a stopgap. So now you may wonder why we can go through this wall. That's because there's actually 2 rooms on top of each other, right? That's the problem. We have one we can travel through and one we can't. Thankfully, it always picks the one it can travel through if it can. So that was good. But now you can see there's a second orphanage up here, right? And we can, you know, this can go on all day. We can have as many of those as we want. We can have lots and lots and lots of orphanages. In fact, we could try stressing our rest of our systems out if we want to, just to see what happens, by just making a ton of them, right? And again, this is the nice part about procedural stuff. It's free to do, right? There's really no cost to like stressing the system or testing the system. So one thing I could do is just say like, okay, well, how many orphanages do you want? We'll just say, I don't know, let's try 64 orphanages. And then all we really need to do is just say there's such a thing as an orphanage. We create one. We create, I guess, a previous one. Like so. So we basically just track whichever that one is, and we just do this every time. So each time we create an orphanage, we just like tack it on, right? And off we go. So if I run one of those, in theory, oops, I don't know what happened there. Can you tell me what that crash was? All right. So our debug system runs out of space to record the timings for this, which I guess I can understand. Looks like add entity to hash. Let me get rid of that. Because we really don't need to mark that. Basically, we will run out of space in our debug log because our debug log is only so big. Use chunk space. I don't really know why we were timing all these. We must have been looking for something. They don't need to be timed for any particular reason. We must have been trying to figure out why something was slow. I see, because there's a ticket mutex in there. That's why. For multiple sim regions to work at the same time. That's what that was for. So anyway, in theory now, we just have like infinite orphanages going. You know, a lot of orphanages. And in theory, they all just work, right? And now the world is actually quite large, so large that without something constructive to do in it, you would never walk through it all, right? If I sat here and walked through it all, we would get really, really bored. And so we can just keep going on and on and on, right? But the point about the programming aspect of this, which is the part that I'm actually, you know, trying to show you, is just that once you construct things out of functional pieces like this, and I mean I should say procedural pieces, not functional. I don't mean functional programming like that kind of functional. But once you construct things out of procedural pieces like this, it's free to sort of, and you have then a central routine that then tries to lay them all out based on what you said, you can just start jamming stuff together and it works, right? There's nothing stopping you then. You can just kind of go nuts with it, right? And so now, out of just one call that makes an orphanage, we can make infinite orphanages and you can walk around them all the time. And more importantly, as we add random variability to our orphanage, then each orphanage would be different, right? Because it's going to roll different random numbers for it. And this is the backbone of making a proper procedural world, is exactly that kind of a system. So now we can start making functions that generate other things, things that we actually want to make that reflect gameplay elements in the world, and then those things will just be calls that we can make. When we decide that the world needs one of those things, we just make the call and connect it up, and we're done, right? And so that's the kind of backbone we're looking for, and that should give you an idea of how we want to proceed as we go through this procedural generation portion of the game, right? Okay. So moving on, if we actually go into the world gen part here, and you'll also notice how irrelevant the time for that was. So 64 orphanages, we maybe walked through 3 or 4 of them there. So in terms of just, even if you're walking straight through, not having to do any play or beating any enemies or anything, you know, you're talking about something like probably, what, 10 minutes or 20 minutes even just to walk from one side to the other. you can see that it's trivial to create arbitrarily large things now without costing, like, there was no loading waiting thing happening there. It's just there, right? So we're not even in danger of costing too much time. We don't have to place a little like reticulating splines thing up on the screen yet either. We're not in danger of that at all. Even creating as much of a world as we probably ever will. You know, I don't know how big an individual playthrough of Handmade Hero is going to be, but it's supposed to be the kind of game where you play multiple runs of it, not where one run takes an infinity of time. So it's supposed to be more like a Binding of Isaac sort of style, or Spelunky or something like that, where an individual run through the game takes a couple hours at most. So at that, what we're seeing now, you can kind of see, hopefully, even if we crank this number very high, we're just not in a lot of danger, right? And really the only thing that's giving us trouble is the fact that our debug code runs out of space to record everything we did. I'm going to get rid of that in begin ticket mutex there as well. So the other thing that I think is really good, and I think we should pat ourselves on the back for this as well, is you can already see our architecture is pretty useful at this point as well, because you can sort of see that we're not having any trouble managing the fact that the number of entities in the world right now is incredibly large, right? So each one of these orphanages is several thousand entities because every floor tile is an entity, right? And we've got now, you know, somewhere on the order of probably 500,000 entities in the game, and then nobody cares, right? The speed is totally fine. And we could just crank that number all day long and it won't matter. Why? Because we were smart about how we set up our worlds so that we only consider portions of them at the time. And so we don't have to worry about the fact that once we start dumping millions of entities into the system, it doesn't roll over and die. It's just like, fine, I don't care. Put as many entities in as you want. If you've got memory to store them, I'll be happy to use them. Furthermore, we actually even made our system even more robust than that. Our system actually could support swap to disk, which nowadays is irrelevant. I mean, machines have 16 gigabytes of memory. How much entities are you really going to have, right? So it's kind of irrelevant, but it's worth noting that even before we've even optimized our entity system at all, remember, our entity system is this giant fatty thing that just, entities are huge, right? We haven't even looked at making those efficient in any way. Doesn't matter. The system just handles it. It's not an issue, right? Such that if we were to count how many entities we actually have, I bet we would be surprised at what the number was, right? I don't know how high it is, but you know, let's say we looked at it. There it is, create entity, or allocate entity ID. So if we just looked at allocate entity ID, what we can see is the world has a running counter. So if I just stop the game in the middle somewhere, right? So here we are, and I say, all right, just let's stop here. Then if I come out and just look for something that'll have the world in it. So here's the world mode. Here's the world. We should in here be able to look at what the entity storage ID is. You can see it here. So it's 250,000 entities in the system right now. And again, it just doesn't care, right? It's like a complete non-issue. And so again, I think that's really nice. Like, we architected our system well, and we anticipated some of those needs because we knew we want to be a big game potentially, where it could have lots of rooms and lots of entities and lots of people doing things in the game and whatever else. So good on us for that. We now know that's actually true. And I'm assuming we could crank this number fairly high and really not be in that much danger. I don't know that we need to crank it any higher than it is right now, but we can certainly see what that ends up being. And I think if we turn off the debug system so we don't have to worry about that overflowing, which again, that is set up just for debug. It's not ever something that's going to ship. We could see. So if we wanted 1 million entities, we'd do something like that, I think. And just see whether 1 million entities causes us any problems. Again, I don't know whether the debug system needs to have some of its recording taken out of there. It still does, right? And so I don't know how we really want to look at that. Maybe what I'll do, because I don't really feel like taking too much more of that out, maybe I'll just set internal to 0, so it just won't look at that anymore. Debug string and HUD timed function look like they don't have. It looks like we never put those in there. We just go ahead and add those. So we want those to go away, right? In this mode. Because they are no longer functional. So if I run it without the debug system, I think we should be fine. And and I guess we get full screen at that point as well. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before, which is I'm going to look in here and see what that value is. It should be something like 1 million. Yeah. So I think, we did what I wanted to do when I was showing how to build that system, which is that even though currently our entity system is complete nonsense, right? We have not done anything to it. I mean, look at this thing. We just stuffed whatever we wanted in there. It's got arrays of stuff in here. It's got the lighting storage for every entity in the world, even people who are nowhere near the visible area, right? We have done nothing to this. It's huge and unnecessary. Doesn't matter. We can still make a ton of them because, hey, computers are fast and have lots of memory these days. So as long as we make a system that only considers a small number at a time, it's free to just have a ton of them that we don't see, right? That we don't deal with. It just works. And so we take a little bit of a startup hit here when they're all being created, when 1 million entities are being made. But it's not that big of a hit. And once we're ready to go, right? And now we can walk through 1,000 orphanages. If each orphanage takes 10 seconds to walk through, I don't know, it probably took a little more than 10 seconds, probably more like 20 seconds. Oops, don't use that. Use the real calculator. Right, if we figure 20 seconds times 10,024 orphanages, so we say that's how many minutes that takes, that's how many hours it takes. It would take 5.5 hours walking from end to end to just cover all of those, right? So that, to me, is a totally reasonable proof of concept there. It just says, look, we did it right. We're good to go. We can make any world we want in this thing, and it's never going to roll over and die on us. So, awesome, right? Very, very good. And I think you could probably just keep cranking this number on and on and on, and your startup time would just be bad, right? Because then you would, at some point, that unoptimized entity thing is going to cause a problem, right? Oh, and and we do have this weird world structure we added here. Once we add too many rooms, we didn't actually make that's not a real thing yet. So that would hold us back, right? This thing here. So eventually we don't really want a fixed array of rooms, right? We want to handle that properly. But that was just some test code we were putting in there so we could outline rooms and stuff like that. But anyway, so in theory, again, this number just cranks as high as we want, and probably we just won't have much trouble with it. I don't know because, again, we never really need to get up to this high, but just it's fun to play around with it and just make sure so we can kind of see, did we break anything? Did we do anything stupid? And it looks like the answer is we really didn't. Like, it seems like we did it pretty reasonably well. And if we look at how many entities are in the world now, yeah, so now we've got 4.5 million entities in this world, and it's just fine with that, right? So I think that's great. I think we did what we needed to do, and now I think we've got a good solid system that we can just keep building on, and it's never gonna come back and bite us like it would if if we hadn't have thought through those things. Okay, so now that we've got that sort of test out of the way, I don't want to create an infinity of orphanages. That is nobody's idea of a good time. So let's just go ahead and get back to the basics here. Single orphanage. And instead of creating more rooms today, which I think we might want to do tomorrow, I think I'll do that. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I would like to address the bug that we have, or one of them, right off the bat, because it's going to become important pretty soon. And that is this bug of two rooms getting placed on top of each other, right? So you can see right here, we've got two rooms placed on top of each other. That's where the z-fighting is coming from. There's supposed to be 3 rooms, right? So there's supposed to be hold on a second. Let me get our mouse pointer back here. So there's supposed to be 3 rooms. Also, you know what's interesting? We haven't looked at the profile here, have we? Yeah. So out of these rooms, we know that we've messed up because there's supposed to be another hero's bedroom, right? There should have been a 3rd hero's bedroom here somewhere. It's not there. Why isn't it there? What happened? Well, what happened is once we place a hero bedroom there at the outset as our seed room and say, generate the rest of the world from here, it then does exactly what we told it to do. It looks at the rooms connected to the hero's bedroom. It finds one room, which is this hallway. It places that hallway relative to the hero's bedroom, right? So it looks and goes, okay, walk along that edge, place the hero's bedroom. There's no other things to place there, so we're done. Then it goes, let me place all the rooms connected to the hallway, which is exactly what we wanted to do, right? That's fine. But then, immediately thereafter, it will look back and go, oh, there's other rooms I haven't placed along this edge, right? I haven't placed like this room. So I need to place the rooms along the edge of this hallway. It then starts placing those rooms. It goes 1, 2, 3. It won't move the existing hero's bedroom that's placed here, right? It won't try to place that because it's already placed. It'll only place the other 2 bedrooms. And it will place them starting at the head end and moving backwards. That places the second hero bedroom right on top of the first one. Why? Because nothing in that routine ever looks to see if there's already a room there. Now, this would be a problem even if we didn't do the ping pong, even if we didn't place a room, go to a new room, and then come back and skip that room and place 2 other rooms and happen to place over. It would be a problem in general. Why would it be a problem in general? Well, think about what would happen if, let's say, there were some rooms off of this room, like a room here, and then a room here, and here, and here, or something that curved around. Well, that may create a little tail that would like intersect the rooms that are here. And so we would need to know that we can't put a room there because there's already something there, and we should try to shift the rooms somewhere else, right? So a very minor modification we can make to this strategy to begin with, to start getting our room placement code to be a little bit smarter and do a little bit better work, is to look at what rooms are already there and not put something in a place that would intersect an existing room. All right, so let's go ahead and try that. What I want to do is do exactly what I was just saying, actually. I would like to start to look at this bit here. And I think we want to sort of have a 2-tiered structure here, right? So we have the chunk hash, and the chunk hash is a really great way of storing all of our entities. As you just saw, it allows us to scale to arbitrarily many entities and be fine. So you can plug 4 million, 8 billion, I don't care how many things you put in there. Eventually you'll run out of memory, but you won't run out of performance because we will just go ahead and handle that nice and clean. However, that chunk hash is not particularly useful for talking about things at room granularity. And there are times when we want to talk about things at room granularity. 2 times. One time is we want to be able to check for room-based abutment and collision really quickly as part of the room generation. So that's one thing we want to have in there. And the other thing we want to have in there is we want to have a way of being able to show things like a map, right, of the game to the player at runtime. So not just for our debugging purposes, but we may want to have a mini map or a world map, right? Because, most games like the kind we're talking about here, Legend of Zelda, Binding of Isaac, these sorts of games tend to now have mini maps or world maps that you can switch to view. And so if we want to do something like that, it's going to be really expensive if the only way that we can produce that map at a high level of zoom, so like a little, where like each room is like a little tiny square or something. If the only way you can produce that map is by looking at all of the entities and drawing them all, that may just be too expensive. So a more useful potentially way to deal with that is to have a 2-tiered structure where all of the entities and the things that actually affect the gameplay, they're all in the chunk hash. But then we also have this separate data structure that's just an accelerated data structure meant to do nothing other than mapping, right? So that's all it does. It does not know anything else about anything. It just has room boundaries so that when we want to draw those, it's very quick. And it could even be like somewhat hierarchical so that if there's 2 levels of zoom, like, oh, I'm in the orphanage, so there's an orphanage map, and I can display that very quickly without having to pull in all of the orphanage entities to draw the entire orphanage. That's one level. And then there's also a level above that where the orphanage itself is just one boundary, right? So if you kind of think about how that might go, that's what we want to start looking at now. And we want to look at that from the perspective of both generation, because we're generating things in that way and needing to do those queries at generation time to find out whether we're overlapping something and so on. But we also want to keep an eye towards how will we display this to the player when we need to put up something like a map screen. And both the mini map kind that hovers in the corner, we may or may not want that. I don't know if we do. But both that kind and then the kind where we see more of a world map, like where you're not necessarily looking at any particular region's rooms. There's just a box that says orphanage or something, right? All right. Let's let's look at this a little more closely here. So if I were to imagine, because I think this is a case where we can write the API first, because, or sorry, the usage code first. Let's take a look at what we want just for this one situation, which we now know that we have. And also, let's move some of this stuff out of here because we now have code that we really just don't need to talk about anymore, like this stuff in here. We may want to use it for reference a little bit later on, but I kind of want to get it out of my visual field. Right, so now I can comment that out and it will be grayed out, right? And I can move some of this other stuff down there as well, because I don't want to look at any of this either, because this is not involved. This is the old sort of placeholder code we were using to just create rooms for when we were trying to do the engine, right? But it wasn't ever really intended to be real world gen code. But we might want to look at it at some point in case we want to see how we did like the stairs or something when we put stairs in again to the generator or something like that. So I don't want to delete it entirely. I just want it down there for reference, so I don't have to go pulling through old versions of the code to find it necessarily. But I don't want it in my way anymore. So that's gone. Goodbye. So now if we come through here, I want to take a look at this layout code. We come through here, we do our place rooms along edge, right? And our place rooms along edge is working real good. And the only problem that we're having with it, right, is at some point we get to a place right here where when we place this volume, we accidentally romp right over an existing room. So what would we do if we wanted to be a little bit more careful, right? If we wanted to sort of place rooms with an eye towards not screwing that part up. Well, there's a couple things. So first of all, we know that we have some leeway as to where we place rooms along an edge sometimes. So if an edge is not fully subscribed, like, and what do I mean by fully subscribed? If you imagine the parameters, let me go ahead and get Milton going here. Milton, by the way, really an excellent drawing package at this point. I highly recommend using Milton for your stream illustrations. Really just great. Sergio has done a really nice job getting this to a good place. If you think about what it's doing right now, it has almost every day of Handmade Hero is on the same blackboard, right? It's nuts. I mean, look at this. Try doing this in Photoshop. Like, good luck, my friend. You know what I'm saying to you? Roll over and die so hard. So I think Sergio did a really great job on this thing, and it has been rock solid for me now. He fixed some of the bugs that were in there that were preventing it from being a pretty smooth user experience. It is just silky smooth now. I highly recommend it. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and just draw what I was talking about with edge subscription there. So let's just talk about edge subscription. Oops. So I'm borrowing a term there just to say that, look, if I've got a room and I say that 3 rooms need to be on that side, it could be that those rooms literally cannot be placed in any other way than just like this. Like if they need one, an entryway there, an entryway there, and an entryway there is the maximum you could have stuffed in there, right? That's the best you could have done. We could say that that edge was like fully subscribed, was the term I was sort of using in my head. There's nothing you can do. There's no freedom there, right? So this is like fully subscribed. Then there's like undersubscribed. So it's like, oh yeah, I just got this one thing to put there. And that means it could go anywhere, right? So there's like a degree of freedom where it could go anywhere from here to here, the door could go, right? And we know it has to be on that edge, so we couldn't move it to another edge, but we can put it anywhere on that edge that we want. And then there's oversubscribed, which is just an illegal scenario, right? That means the generation code announced to us that it wanted a bunch of rooms placed here, and they don't all fit, right? So no matter what you do, they're gonna overlap. So this case cannot be handled. That's just an error further up the chain. Like the gameplay generation code fundamentally asks us to create a room that cannot exist in practice. At the very least, it would have had to say that this room can stretch, right, or something. So we're really talking about these two cases here, which we sort of handle now, but not really, right? And so trying to get more towards actually really handling these cases correctly, and again, like I said, we've only got 10 minutes or something. No, that's not true. We've got 25 minutes. We started at 15 after today, right? Yeah. So if we actually look at this and go, so I should be able to make a little progress on this today. So what we want to do is say, if we want to start handling these cases correctly, what we need to do is take a look at a room, and when we are going to place it, say, look, assuming we're undersubscribed at all, we actually could start here and test a bunch of positions to see where we can place the room. And if any of them work, we can proceed. So what we want to do is we want to take this loop, have it try a bunch of positions for a room if it can, and accept any one that works. That way, all we need is a query that says, can room be, in volume? So we just ask, look, here's one place we could place a room. Is that legal? And it's like, nah. We're like, okay, can we place it here? Nah, right? Now that may not end up being the most efficient way to do it, and we may want to do something that actually says how far we should have moved. And so we may make this a little bit more fancy so we don't have to keep querying unnecessarily. So another way we could phrase this is query with direction, right? So we could say, look, here's my room. I want to place it here. Tell me, where is the first place I could place this room in this direction? So when it sees what overlaps, so it does a query to see what this room overlaps, it could go, oh, well, once you get here, you're not overlapping anymore. So you could put it there, right? And the reason to do that is because if you think about what has to happen, one is a blind search and one's a directed search, right? So in the blind search case, that is what this would be. It says, look, I don't know where these other rooms might be that are overlapping. I'm going to try here. And you're going to give me back a Boolean answer that just says yes or no. The problem with yes or no is all that tells me is if this exact location was okay. When I get back a yes from you, I'm super happy, down goes the room. If I get back a no, well then I don't know anything, right? So I have to test literally the next possible placement one tile over and ask again. Now you may have known, even just from a single intersection, the code that's doing the query immediately knows that's stupid, because even if all it did was exit out on the first overlap, it still knows we shouldn't try again till here, right? It still knows where to try next. And that may not work as well, so it is still a search. It may be that we need to do another query to look at what else might overlap that room. But it's a much more directed search. It uses the information that it gets back on a no to avoid other queries that will obviously be no. So I think what we want to do here is we want to set up that API, that call, to give us back where to try next when we move, to avoid lots of little tiny queries looking for that edge when the thing can just, it knows where the edge is. Just tell us where the edge is, right? So I think we want to kind of go that route with it. That's all I'm trying to say. So that's what we want to start working on now. And we may not get that done before the end of the stream, but that's where we're going. And we've got all tomorrow to do it, and we should be able to have something nice working for that tomorrow. It's just rectangle overlap testing, and then we need an acceleration structure for that. To start with, just for the orphanage, there are not enough rectangles in the orphanage to even require a spatial hierarchy, so that should allow us to do a brute force version quickly and get it working, which is what we'll try to do now. But then we want to do something that's going to be a little smarter than that, because like I said, if we do want to do stuff like crank ourselves up to hundreds of thousands of rooms, which we do because the rest of our system handles it, we shouldn't make the generator be something that rolls over and dies at that point. So we can't be linearly searching through all of our rooms for overlap every time. That's not going to cut it. That's a little dance for you. Hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so moving back, what I want to do now is I want to go through here and take a look at how I would want to call this, right? Given the things that I just explained. So what you can see here is one of the things we do is we start off at the minimum position along the edge. and that gets started at right here, and then we move forward. Now, this actually isn't maximally trying all of the places that we probably should try to place things. There's actually a lot more variability than that involved. And what we may want to do is change that scheme. So in the future, what we probably want to do is take a more considered approach where we say, look, we will pre-check our connections. We'll see how many things we're going to try and place, and then we'll try to choose a strategy that logically looks for where we might want to connect rooms up, right? So we're going to get more advanced as we go. Right now, we'll leave it as it is because we only have one specific bug we're going to fix, but we want that process of testing where we want to place rooms along an edge to get more advanced as we go, because this is pretty weak sauce right here. I mean, the whole thing is weak sauce because we just started it, but that in particular is weak sauce that we can specifically pinpoint. We know what we could do that would be an improvement. So once we get into the connections, here's our tests for whether or not this room wants to be placed here in the first place. And when we find out that it does, we can see is we actually very specifically look at these volumes here and start setting them directly. I want to do that. I want to start with a test volume. So what I want to do here is say gen volume test vol, and I want to go from there. So all of these things that talk about room vol, I want to talk about test vol instead. So I'm just going to do a real quick search and replace here, like so. Oops. I don't want to replace base room though. Guess I'm gonna have to be pretty judicious here. No. 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 Okay. When we get to the end, then I will say that room volume equals test volume, and off we go. So now I should have a situation where I can talk about test volume. Test volume at the outset can just be nothing in particular because we set all of its axes. So really we don't have to worry about that. In fact, I can, if I want to, just not initialize it because it should have all the rest of the stuff initialized. So then when I run this, I should see exact same thing we saw before, and now we're just doing that on a test volume. So now what I want to do is I want to essentially enter a loop here where I look for tests. What just happened? Did I accidentally remove what? That's odd. Is this a forecoder bug that I have never seen before? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's confused about how to indent that. Is it not? Maybe it's not. What happened here? Something weird's going on here. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's just a bug in forecoder. It's one I've never seen before. This is not the latest version. But I've literally never seen that bug before. That's really weird. How would I have not seen it before? Well, I gotta make a note to myself to update the forecoder on this machine, because that is probably a bug that has probably gotten fixed. I don't tend to have much problems with forecoders, so I sometimes am a bit behind on the stream machine. I tend to switch my dev machine pretty frequently, though, to the latest version. Update HH forecoder build. Send. All right, so I don't know what's going on there. Will that redo it? Okay. So hopefully we can keep, hopefully this will keep screwed up. And so I can do a to-do Casey, see if new build of vocoder still has the bug here. Because we'd want to report that to Alan so he can fix it. But I don't want to report it to Alan on an old version of vocoder because he may already have fixed it. And then I'm just reporting a bug that's wasting his time. So I'd rather update the build first and then see what goes on there. Okay. So if I go ahead and now start this process, now obviously if I actually ran this code, we'd be in trouble because it's going to loop forever. So what I really want to do here is essentially say if one break, otherwise loop, and then we get essentially the pseudo setup for what I want to actually do, which is right here. When we've prepared the volume we're going to test, I want to test to see whether or not that volume would actually work, right? And furthermore, I want this at edge P version here to be a little bit more careful about how it updates things. Because in the case where I actually get a room placed here, then it's actually okay. But I don't know that I want, I don't know that I want to keep it so I just place the rooms one after another. The reason is because maybe what I want to do now is start at the minimum and try to place the room each time anew. Why? Because if I have two rooms of different sizes, now that I'm testing for overlap, it may be that one of the rooms can't be placed in like the starting area, the starting, you know, well, let me just draw it, right? Instead of me waving my hands around like a maniac. So if I'm doing a search along the edge this way, right? And I've got two rooms that I'm trying to place, one that looks like that and one that looks like this. This is the first room I'm trying to place. I come in here, there's another room right there. I try to place this room here and it's like you can't place it there. So it ends up going, oh, I could place it here, so I place it there. If I then assume, you know, maybe there's another room, let's say there's another room over here. If I then assume that the next room has to start looking right here, it'll be like, ah, can't place the room, bro, right? Bad news. Well, this room actually could have gone right here, but I never tested it because I just tried to place it after that. So what I think I want to do is, now what I want to do is just start at the beginning and let the overlap tester tell me where I can't place rooms so we can slot rooms into positions where they could have fit. Again, it's not quite good enough. You need more strategies than these, but it starts to make a more robust system, right? You can see how it's gaining a little bit more possibility as we do that than just placing them neighbor-wise, right? It still doesn't handle all the possibilities because it may be that you should have placed the other room first and this one second, because maybe the way you place the second room ends up allowing you to place the first room better and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, there's more to it than this, but again, it's getting a little bit better, right? The coffee is gone. The coffee is gone. You'll notice I'm actually drinking a branded coffee today because the espresso machine is broken. And that's a very sad time. Basically, like, you know, we at Molly Rocket, if you actually go buy coffee every time you want coffee, that is fantastically expensive, especially for a little indie company. So we actually have a little coffee making machine, and we needed to clean out the little grinder piece for the coffee making machine. And it has this little felt piece, and I tried to clean it, and it just kind of shredded. It just disintegrated. So we needed to order a new one, and until the new little felt pieces, they cost like $2 a piece. So they're pretty cheap to get, but we had to wait for it to come. Until that comes, we have to actually get coffee at an actual coffee shop, which, despite being more expensive, also has the downside of you actually have to go there. Instead of just having infinite coffee on demand for very cheap, which is the best part about a coffee making machine. So highly recommend coffee making machines, but unfortunately today, not in the cards. Very sad. Anyway, don't know why I bothered mentioning that. I guess just if you're an indie who doesn't have a lot of money, you should get a coffee machine instead of getting coffee out, but that is probably the most obvious thing that everyone would automatically do. So I don't know why I'm bothering to tell you that. It's kind of the same as saying don't eat dinner at a restaurant, make it yourself, which everyone knows. So there's some information that indies should use that they would just do by necessity because it's painfully obvious. I hope. If there's any indie out there who doesn't already know that, I don't think they're going to last very long. Anyway, yeah. Doesn't matter. Point being, if I keep moving on here and looking at the code that's actually important, rather than telling you tips on not spending money on coffee, which hopefully everyone could figure out on their own, what you want to do here is say, look, let's start at the place, the min edge, right, every time, and we'll work from there out on every room placement. And before we were counting on that to keep our rooms separate. Now we're just going to test to see if there's anything in the way, so that will keep our rooms separate, and we don't have to worry about this part anymore. So the @edge_p probing piece will now be something that gets updated much more straightforward. So what we'll say is, okay, here's where we place the room. It's wherever our probe is, and it goes to this, oops. It goes to this maximum, right? And then what we want to do is we want to update our @edge. First of all, if the room can be placed, we don't have to do anything, right? If the room can be placed, we're done. We move on to the next room, or we're just done if there are no more rooms on this edge. But if we do have another room on this edge, then what we want to do is update @edge_p at this point, right? And so what I'd like to do is say, okay, we know the direction we're searching because we go from the min to the max, generally speaking, right? That's just how it works. So what we want to do is when we send down this information, we want to get back the distance we would move from our location, for example, in order to fit, right? We want it to sort of tell us that piece of information. So what we want to do is we want like some kind of a check for overlap, or like get room overlap delta or something like this, right? So we want to say, I don't know, get delta along axis for placement or something. So we wanted for clean placement. So we want basically something that's going to tell us, look, how far would we have to move this thing in order to put it down? You know, how far would we have to go in order to put this thing without it overlapping some other room in the mix, right? So I give you the test volume. This is the thing that we're actually going to try to put down. And I'll give you the generator, which will have the hierarchy in it that you can use to query eventually. And then I'll just say, look, I don't care about the other axes because I can only move it along this edge. So you got to move it this way, right? This is the direction it can go. It's along this dimension. So if that delta equals 0, then we know that we can place the room. If that delta is not 0, then we'll just try to move it that amount and see if we can place it after that, right? So at that point, what we could say is, well, you know, the delta, this function can now emulate our existing code by just returning 0. Because if all the function does is return 0, that just says every room can be placed, right? And now this isn't great because we took out the part where we actually walk along the @edge_p. So now all of the rooms will get placed on top of each other, which is not great, right? You can kind of see how all the rooms that were previously arrayed along an edge have folded in on themselves, right? But otherwise, all the code is working fine. So now all we should have to do is in this code actually go through and test to see whether the volume overlaps. If it does overlap, we can just move as far as that one overlap and then we're done. Because the outside code will continue to try. So let's go ahead and do that. And like I said, we don't have a spatial hierarchy, so we're going to do this in a really piggy way. I don't know if my pig hat's on right now. So we're going to do that in a really wasteful way that's very expensive to compute. And so why are we doing that? Well, the answer is because never give yourself two things to debug at the same time when you could just do one and then the other. So what I want to do here is I want to give myself the brute force version, get that working properly, and then we can do a spatial hierarchy accelerated version, because if I do them both at the same time, we don't know where the bug is, right? If I do the brute force version once, then we know the bug is just with our algorithm. And then we can fix that and be done. Then we do the spatial hierarchy. If there's a bug, we know it's in the spatial hierarchy, right? If we do them both at the same time, I don't know which one's broken. Maybe the spatial hierarchy is broken, maybe the placement code's broken. And now I have a much more complicated problem, and my debugging has just gotten much more complicated, right? And I'll probably have to end up doing the exact same thing. Drop down to just one version without using the hierarchy or something, see if that works, right? And I'll verify. So you might as well just do it this way first. So piggy is oftentimes better. You want to start with the simplest thing first, get that working, and then make it progressively more complicated, because that just simplifies your debugging and it helps to clarify what you're doing anyway. So it's just usually the best way to go. All right, so once we get to here, we know we can just look at all of our rooms that we have. And so that's pretty easy. We just step over each individual room, starting with the very first room in the game. We then say, look, for every one of these, excuse me, if the rooms overlap, then we need to issue a placement. And if none of them do, then we're just fine. So we need to do the overlap test here. And then all we need to do is say, look, this code can now fail. So at some point, we want this to end. And the time when I think we want it to end is just say, look, if at edge P ever exceeds the maximum edge P, we have to stop, and we can't place this room, right? So at that point, we need to sort of assert, right? We need to assert that we have failed. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a little placed. And in here, I'll say, oh, congratulations, we placed it, right? And that way out here, I can just assert that we've placed for now. In the future, we may take steps if we can't place a room. Right? Okay. Where was my gen room? Global next. All right. So this allows me to loop through all of my rooms, and all I have to do now is see if these two rooms intersect, right? Now we have an intersection code that we've already written. You can see it right here. So if we want to, we can intersect these rooms just fine. So what I can do here is say the intersection of these two rooms. Produces an intersected volume. If that has any volume at all, then we know that we're in trouble. So when we don't actually have a call for that here, but you can see we got getDim and also ismint. So you look at these here, you can sort of see we sort of have the beginnings of what we want here. So we really just want a similar call to one of these calls, which is like has volume, right? And that just says, look, for each one of these things, I guess it's 1 because this will adjust it, right? If each of these is greater than 1, then this thing has some volume. If anything is 0 or less, then it doesn't, right? And I think that's all we really need. Another way to say that would be like this. So if each of the dimensions is greater than 0, then this thing has some volume. So what we can say is, look, if this has volume, then this thing intersects, unfortunately, right? And so we'll just say, look, at that point it intersects, you're going to have to move along the axis. Right here we want to say, actually return the amount to move, which isn't hard to do, but we're just going to ignore even that for right now. So we're going to do the intersection. Assuming that it does intersect, then we tell it it's got to keep trying somewhere else. And that's the basic sketch of the routine. And now we just have to make sure that it actually works okay. So the first problem we got here is it looks like we cannot actually place the room we started with here. Let me go ahead and switch to debug mode so we can step through. And I'll go a little bit over time here and see what's up. All right. Right, so we cannot place the room. Which rooms were we placing? So we're trying to go from save slot A to the orphanage back hallway, right? So this just looks like we just straight up have a bug here. I probably am returning things incorrectly or something like that, because that looks like the first time through. So let's just make, oh, you know what I forgot to? We actually need to do this. Because rooms that haven't been placed yet don't count, right? So now let me just go ahead and start here. I'm going to go ahead and step through. All right. So we've got our at edge P. Oh. That's great. Let's try that one more time. Also, yeah, no, that's fine. That should really start backwards a little bit. All right, so that looked like that actually worked just fine. So we may be done at that point. Let's find out. So here's the orphanage placement. And so now you can see everything did get placed properly now, right? So now you can see we got those three rooms placed now. And so now we're in better shape, right? So now it won't ever overlay things on top. Now, it's not great because if it gets itself into a situation where it could have placed rooms if it just had arranged them slightly differently, it's too dumb to know how to try that. So it's always going to just do this, and the only thing it will do is avoid overwriting its own rooms. So it's not really out of the woods yet, right? It's still really basic, but at least now it's smart enough to know it won't ever overlap any of its existing stuff in like a really stupid way, right? And so we can kind of sort of maybe a little bit, possibly not entirely, take some comfort in that fact. And we won't get any of those weird problems where the thing overlaps. All right, I'm going to go to the Q&A now. Let me see here. Here we go. Do you plan on making an in-game editor similar to the one in The Witness? No, because this game is procedural. So unlike The Witness, there is no hand-authored content. That is not a philosophical point. Again, because this is not a game design stream, so I don't mean to suggest that there's something bad about hand design content. On the contrary, hand design content is probably quite good. But more specifically, I wanted to focus on showing the programming aspects of level design. And so I want all of the things that we create to be created with generative algorithms so you can see how those algorithms work. So we will not be doing any editor stuff because that's sort of a different situation. Someone said the four-coder thing wasn't a bug. We were missing a bracket. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that was the problem. A bracket accidentally got deleted. Okay. So cool. So Alan does not need a bug report for that. That just a bracket got deleted. Jonathan Blow, hello. Are you back in the United States or not? You want to know how you can get a piggy hat for yourself? This one was given to me as a gift, actually, so I don't even know where this came from. But if I can find one, John, I will make sure you have one so that on your stream, when you're doing something that you know is a little bloated, you can just put it on and have the fashion to go with it. Gary Johansson, I think I know the answer to this question, but do you know of some simple preprocessor library that has iteration as a feature? Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Okay, so are you saying like... Actually, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you saying like you want to write a thing that takes your C code and allows you to put some metacode in it that iterates over something and outputs new code for the C compiler? Or I don't know exactly what you're talking about. Okay. So I guess I don't know. I don't know. In the old days, people used to use M4, but it's awful. No, not the M4 carbine. So people used to use this thing, but it doesn't understand C, so it's not that useful. Gosh, I don't know. There's got to be one out there. It's just I wouldn't recommend using M4, but it's like the only preprocessor library I can think of. I don't know why there isn't a standard C preprocessor library. Probably because everyone keeps using C++, which they're told has the features that they need, but of course it doesn't have them. So just a simple C preprocessor would actually be great because everyone could use it and it would actually be good. And John says he can vouch for how bad M4 is, and so maybe definitely don't use it. Since I just said it was bad and he said it was bad, it's probably pretty bad. But I don't know. I don't know where to get a library for that. It would be cool. LLVM, the Clang toolset has a bunch of stuff in it. that you could maybe sort of massage into what you want, but man, that code base is an epic nightmare. It's like 17 levels of inheritance to do like a really basic, simple thing that would have been like one, little like write to a variable or something. So I don't necessarily recommend that either, but I don't know. If you don't want to write one yourself, I don't know where the good like C preprocessor is. If there is one out there, please someone post it on the stream. That'd be a very useful thing for people to know about. I just don't know. I just don't know. MMD966 asks, hello, sir. I just started creating my first game using SDL in C++. Can you give me some advice? Am I going the right way, or should I change my tools? Plus, I'm looking for a game programming book. Do you know a good one to start with? I worked a little with Unity 3D. I guess what I would say is depends on what your goals are, right? What I usually tell people is if their primary interest is just making a game, like they want to be a game designer, I would not write your own engine, right? And the reason for that is that it's a lot of work and knowledge and skills that you have to build up to do something like that, which I think is really valuable and good, and people should do it if they want to be a game engine programmer. But if all you want to do is design games, you should just use an existing engine, because otherwise you will find yourself spending a ton of time learning things you don't care about. That's the problem, right? Game engine programming is difficult. It's a discipline that requires knowledge and skill. And if you want to do it, it's very rewarding and interesting, and I highly recommend it. But if you don't, then you will probably fail in your attempts to make one because you won't enjoy what you're doing, right? And so that's a really critical difference to figure out first. What do you want to be? Do you want to be a game engine programmer, or do you want to be a game designer? If you want to be a game designer who's very avant-garde and pushes the boundaries of things, you may also have to be a game designer. That's like what John does, right? What John Blow does. A lot of stuff he does, you can't do in an existing engine, right? When Braid came out, there was nothing that could have run that game. I don't even know if there still is anything that can run that game, right? Like, I don't know what something like Unity would do if you tried to make the X coordinate of a player be the time value of the entity system and expect rewinding to be in the mix, right? At that point, you're kind of an engine programmer whether you want it or not. But if that's not what you're trying to do, if you're like, I just want to make my little JRPG or whatever, right? Then, go use an appropriate tool for that job, because if that's what you're trying to do, you'll be happier focusing on just the parts that are to design and not the part that's the engine. So you have to figure out which one of those you're trying to do first. If you've decided that you want to be an engine programmer, and like if you were going to go apply for a job, you'd want an engine programming job. Maybe you want to go work at Unity to make the next edition of engines, or maybe you want to go work at Epic and make the next version of the Unreal Engine, or maybe you want to go work at Rockstar and make the next version of Grand Theft Auto, which is always on a custom engine, right? Blah 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 blah. Depending on what your goals are there, you may want to start doing your own engine programming, and in that case, C++ plus SDL is a pretty good way to go. A lot of games use SDL. It's reasonable. Not everything in it is something that I would necessarily think is the right way to do things, but then again, that's true of everything, right? Everyone always has different ways they would do things. So using SDL is a fine way to get started. And it abstracts away the platform part that maybe you don't want to focus on right now. For programming books, I don't know. I haven't read any of the ones in recent memory. But, I've heard good things about the game engine programming book that I think just got revised to its 3rd edition or is soon being revised. Anyway, Jason Gregory's engine book is probably a good bet. Again, I haven't read any of these books because it's just been a long time since I've been looking for intro to architecture kinds of stuff. But I suspect this is probably a good one. Jace is pretty no nonsense. He tends to be pretty serious about design, and it's probably a reasonable place to get some information, right? So maybe take a look at that one. I don't know what else. See, Voucher says, the current generator always creates 2 tile-wide walls when rooms are adjacent. Will you leave it like this because it's easier to include the walls inside the room volume? Would you take the same approach if the tile size were not tied to the traversable size, which would allow for thinner walls, for example? We will probably support both, actually. So at the moment, I'm just making the room generation code is really weak, right? It's just kind of sitting there waiting for us to go play with that more. So it doesn't know about the concept that we may want to overlap rooms and have a shared wall boundary between them. So I would actually say we might make 1 tile wide things in some places as well. So I don't know what we'll do there. But the only reason it's doing it that way right now is just because that's sort of the way we had been doing things. Our previous rooms were that way. Rooms had their own walls to them. And you kind of had to do it that way in the old days when it was tile mappy, because you had 1 tiles on one side and 1 tile on the other side for the angle of the wall. We don't have to do that because we have actual 3D now. So we could do a single wall down the middle. Whether we want to or not will depend on some gameplay concerns that I don't know. So I guess what I would say is we probably will end up having some areas where we only want 1 wide, and we'll see how to do that when we get there. But why not? One says libclang can parse your code and give you the AST. It's a simple C interface. So that might be a place to go if you can maybe boil it down to that. Falbus, can you show the game? I just fell asleep and missed all the coding. I'm sure. For you, Valbus, absolutely. So we just were making the thing that would create the orphanage layout. So you can see there it is, right? And this is the orphanage layout we said we wanted, right? What to do if a CS course enforces OOP? Well, so the thing with object-oriented programming is it's a common requirement for courses or for work. So, you know, OOP is one of those things that I think will be gone in 30, 40 years as anything that anyone ever thought was useful or interesting, right? I don't think it's got any legs on it. It's one of those like fad things that, you know, once we actually have metrics, people will go, oh yeah, this was dumb or whatever. So I don't think it's got much legs to it, but it's definitely around at the moment. And so I don't think you should look at a CS course enforcing OOP as a problem. You should know how to program object-oriented programming because you may be asked to do it, or you may have to use code that does it. And if you don't understand how it works, you're at a disadvantage there, right? I know how to do object-oriented programming. If you want me to do an object-oriented style program, I can do that, right? I know how to do template metaprogramming. Like, I can do all those things. I choose not to because after having used them, I know that they are too limited and I don't find them to work. Right? Especially not in C++ where the object-oriented programming constructs are weak. There are languages where the object-oriented programming constructs are stronger, and there's more of an argument to use them in those languages. C++ is not that language, right? But either way, just because object-oriented programming is usually a bad idea doesn't mean that you shouldn't know how to do it, especially in today's work environment. You will probably be called upon to understand, at least, if not write, object-oriented programming code at your first job, because many places use it, sadly. And so you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to understand what people are talking about when they talk about object-oriented code. You need to be able to understand how people expect object-oriented code to look and behave so that you can make it and interface with it as necessary. I would never write it because I don't think it's useful. That's different from saying you shouldn't know how it works. Not everything that sucks shouldn't be understood, right? And furthermore, if you never actually learn it yourself, you wouldn't know that it's lousy. You just have to take my word for it. And what if I'm wrong? Tons of people tell you OOP is good, and I'm telling you they're wrong, right? If you always took their advice, you'd never learn how to do things the non-OOP way. And in my opinion, that'd be really bad. Similarly, maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, you need to know that. So learning different programming styles is very important, because if you don't learn them, you cannot make an honest assessment yourself, take a step back and go, which of these things do I think actually results in more well-working programs in less time, etc. So don't think of your OOP class or job as, man, this is awful and I'm not getting out of this. Think of that as your opportunity to understand object-oriented programming and assess it. And that's valuable. Even if you come away thinking the exact same thing I think, which is that it's useless, now you know. Now you know for real. You don't know just because I told you. You know because you evaluated it. And that's going to be really valuable to you going forwards, because I'm not going to be there to tell you everything, right? You can't just go ask me or some other person what to do. You should be able to assess every new programming technique that you're exposed to. You should be able to learn it, evaluate it, and make a decision about whether you want some or all of that in your programming style, right? Without having to appeal to an expert on the topic somewhere and trust that they know what they're talking about. Oftentimes they don't, or even if they do, it may be true for their circumstance and not yours. Maybe there's certain things that on a large team are useful programming practices that when you're a team of one just don't make any sense. Which one of those are you doing? Well, don't assume that everything they said then just applies, right? Maybe you're doing really performance-oriented programming and something else isn't. Maybe those two things create very different programming requirements, right? Blah, 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 blah. So I think that's really how you should approach opportunities to learn things like object-oriented programming that you may kind of know a priori are a waste of time. It's not necessarily a waste of time to figure that out yourself, or go into it with an open mind and see if you come to similar conclusions, because you may learn something really valuable there. What do you think about Lua and Love 2D? I have not used them. What paradigm do you use instead of OOP? We just focused on straightforward procedural programming, like the traditional style of C programming that was around before OOP. Jonathan Blow adds, the problem is that understanding why OOP is really bad probably requires 5+ years of experience, because it takes that long to be able to build sufficiently complex programs such that you know what should be easy or which complications are unnecessary. I guess I would say I do agree with that, but I don't know what else to say. You need to be able to learn why things are good and bad, and I think building up that experience is useful. I don't know that you want to do 5 years of OOP programming exclusively, like I did, for example, before I came to those conclusions. But I think you want to understand it and try to think about those things at a higher level if possible. So one of the things that I should mention as kind of a programming philosophy point that has to do with OOP as well is that, fundamentally speaking, I also feel like there is sort of a true aspect of programming that's emerging that I become more certain of every year, which is that the problem with object-oriented programming is very similar to the problems with other styles of programming that share its design philosophy, which is that it is a design philosophy divorced from the computer. So there is literally nothing that has anything to do with object-oriented programming in a CPU, right? A CPU is procedural. That is what it is. So when you start to design languages whose core tenets do not respect the fact that the CPU does not have the things that it is claiming are central to the design process, I think you have made a fundamental mistake. That doesn't mean you don't want higher level of language constructs, but what it does mean is those higher level language constructs must be constructed in such a way as to respect the fact that the end product is code that a CPU runs. And C++, for example, long since forgot that. And most object-oriented design forgets that fact. And that fact is crucial. So I think once you divorce yourself from the notion that the important thing is generating CPU code efficiently, and how can you give the programmer the most ability to have control over the CPU code that is generated in a clean and efficient manner, when you've lost sight of that as the goal, and you start to think of the goal as other things that are unrelated to that, then you have fundamentally lost your way, and I think your language will never be good, right? So I think that is really the core language design tenet that should be respected, and OOP does not respect it. Its core tenets are all things unrelated to the CPU, and that's a problem. Again, not even just because of performance or anything like that. It's because the programmer's day-to-day work is to produce a working piece of CPU code, and when your language starts having most of its features not be about that, that is when it becomes cumbersome to do real work with this language. And we've seen that with C++. Doing a very simple thing that you'd think would be very straightforward to do in terms of CPU code generation in C++ is like impossible. And the reason is because they never thought of that as a goal, right? That's why it's been so late to add things that are obvious in terms of CPU code, such as introspection and things like that. So I would just point out that philosophical problem. C++ has it in spades. So do a lot of other object-oriented programming constructs. That's usually the reasons why I end up not liking them, is because I know what I want the CPU to do, and what I am fundamentally looking for is the simplest, smallest possible amount of high-level code I can write that generates that CPU code, not some huge sprawling mess of other CPU code that happens to produce the same result very slowly and with a ton of memory. And that's usually what OOP actually gives you, right? If you're lucky. A lot of times it doesn't even give you that, but you know, that's a separate issue. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close down here. Thank you everyone for joining me for this on a Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along the series at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code, so you can play around with it. If you want to, for example, go try your hand at making some smarter room layout code, you could do that before I get to it, if you'd like, and see how your coding skills have progressed. That's it for today. I'll be back here tomorrow, so if you would like to see some more of the room placement code, that's the place to do it. Same time, same place. Hope to see you back here for that. Until then, have fun programming. I'll see everyone on the internet. Take it easy, everybody.